Good morning. Good morning. So lovely to see uh, the faces this morning, and thank you for joining. Um, so yeah, my name's George. I have worked in organisational development for the last 25 years, and my background is business psychology, and I'm also a chartered member of the CIPD. So that's meant that I've spent most of my life in HR departments, and I think that's been quite an interesting perspective on working in OD and working alongside HR professionals, because it's that sort of translation of methodology and framework into people practice and how it actually becomes implemented within an organization. And of course, the difference between the conversation in the boardroom and then what that looks like down on the factory floor or in the logistics center or within the office. So um, quite interesting to see how OD sort of flows out within all of those different arenas. So yeah, so this morning really is to share my story of my experience with vertical development, and it's lovely to hear that some of you are very experienced with it through to just curious. So it will be a conversation this morning. I will share some of my stories, and then we can share and reflect from your perspective as well. So bit of a
And George,
dialogue, but
and George, can I just say, I think given the range of experience, if you can say something about what vertical development
yes.
means and how you work with it, that's going to be enormously helpful to people.
Absolutely. So I have, yeah, I will absolutely start in that place. So Teresa, I will do a little bit of a leadership development session on vertical development to bring it to life, certainly my understanding of it. And so I came across it about 18 years ago. So similar to Richard and Chris, I'm qualified with Heart Hill and their leadership development profile. And that work is fundamentally based on the work by Bill Talbot. And of course, Jane Lovinger is the kind of founding mother of ego maturity, and it's all to do with developmental psychology. So in that vast field of developmental psychology, a lot of it's on child development, so cognitive development, which I'm sure some of you may be familiar with. And so theorists such as Piaget has done some extensive work looking at how children have that wonderful shift all the time. And if you have children yourselves, you'll notice how they'll be making sense and shifting their understanding of the world and becoming more sophisticated with their understanding. So um, I've got just a couple of slides to share with you today, just to bring it to life. And so I'm just going to share with you now um, the uh, the slides, because there's just one of them that I couldn't resist, actually, the this slide, because it explains so well this kind of revelation for children. So in a very early stage, which is the sensory motor stage of child development, there's something called object permanence. And so what essentially happens when a child is
George,
very young
George, just so
is
you know, we I can only see your title slide at the moment.
yes,
So
sure, Chris. Yeah, I'm going to move on to the next one in a
okay,
moment.
that's great.
So, object permanence is essentially about when you have Teddy in front of a child, and then you hide Teddy behind the sofa, and at that moment when they're really little, they think that's it. Teddy's gone. He's disappeared, and um, and then there will be a shift for children when suddenly you hide the teddy and it's oh, actually teddy's still there, he's just hiding behind the sofa. So I always use object permanence actually when I start explaining vertical development, either to those people I'm coaching or organizations or clients I'm working with, because I think it just brings together um explains nicely that it's a huge cognitive shift for children to suddenly realize that, when you're hiding an object, it still exists. So if you think about adult development, it sort of continues along this theme of actually we don't hit adult and that's it, we know everything, we're a done package. Actually, we continue to evolve as adults, and our thinking becomes more sophisticated, it becomes more complex, and we're essentially kind of upgrading our operating system as we're going through life. So we continue to develop our understanding of the world around us and life and so on. So that's essentially adult development theory. So vertical development is really talking about the stages of adult development. And as I mentioned, Harthill had developed a leadership development profile, which is able to sort of assess which stage someone is at using a profile tool, which is called the leadership development profile. And the way they talk about these stages is it's called action logics. So one more slide just to bring that to life in terms of those action logics. So what you see actually is a number of stages, and really, I think a great way of thinking about it is the shift in understanding reality. So it's this constant shift of making sense of things differently around you. So opportunist, which is early stage, really, in terms of an action logic, is really about it's quite black and white in terms of, quite binary, and you see what you get. It's kind of self-orientated. Um, and there's a feeling of actually it's me against everyone, and I've got to look after myself, and clearly going after opportunity and jumping on things and so on. So it's all about luck and what I can achieve. So um that's really the sort of the sense of the opportunist, and clearly can be very driven to achieve quite a lot, because very based on what can I get out of things around me or people around me. The shift into diplomat and these are big shifts, by the way. I mean, these are stages, so we're talking, years. These aren't kind of very they're not very quick in terms of these stages. These are sort of lifelong stages. Movement into diplomat is very much more about this sort of awareness of those around us. So we become very interested in our group, our sort of social group that we're part of, how we align and kind of conform really to that group. So, and there's a real sense of loyalty, a strong sense of loyalty and duty, and wanting to be part of that group, and adhering to the norm. So this comes through very strongly in terms of, and you could almost imagine with teenagers, for example, there's a real sense of wanting to conform, look like each other, be part of the group and not stick out, and strong values as well around what we stand for from a group perspective, and what's important to us. So moving into expert, and I always sort of think of vertical development as this kind of roller coaster of sort of an internal locus of control, and then moving into more externally aware of things. So the expert, I think, goes back more internally in terms of, again, their understanding of things, and starts to really hone in on expertise. So there's a real admiration for craft logic, a real passion for doing things very well, and sort of professionalism and expertise, and really that passion comes through. And of course, within that expert stage, it can feel quite comforting, in terms of I know this, I know my thing, I know what is what, I know how things work. And yeah, there's certainly sort of a strong sense of identity through my expertise and what I know. Um, and I'm sure some of you are starting to think about, oh, have I seen this in others around me or recognized it? And of course, when you look at the research, many organizations, are we have experts everywhere in society, but you think about organizations, how many experts we need to really fuel organization systems and get things done. So, you know, there's lots of experts, and we need them, actually. We need them to know what they're doing, and have that confidence and capability. The shift into achiever, I think, goes back into that, like, broadening out again of horizons slightly, becoming suddenly super aware of the totality of everything around them. And achiever is a huge stage in many adult people's lives, because it is that kind of pinnacle of everything I am. I'm a sister, I'm a mother, I'm a manager, I'm a, daughter. You suddenly have that kind of enormity of life and everything I am achieving in it. So it's very much about, achievement, about goals. Time is a really interesting concept, I think, within that achiever stage, because there's a real sense of I don't have enough. And, particularly when we're doing feedback to someone who's in an achiever stage, there's a lot of conversation and theme around I don't have enough, I feel I'm maxed out, lack of capacity, and so on. So there's something about, I have a lot of expectation of myself to get things done, and it's all about results for me. Um, but the achiever is essentially operating from a kind of a quite clear frame of how they do things still. So they've got that expert still bubbling along. And by the way, these are cumulative, these stages. So you build on these stages. You don't sort of switch completely and turn off the others. It accumulates over time. So there's still that sense of an internal framework of how things work. I understand how the world works, and then my huge job that I need to do within it, essentially. So those sort of expert achiever stages are what the LDP talks about as conventional stages of action logic. The movement from achiever to individualist is quite significant, because individualist is the first of the post-conventional action logic. So moving into a different realm of making sense of the world. And this is quite a big shift, because it goes from kind of having quite a good grip on things and understanding and knowing everything I need to achieve and being busy, 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 to almost I always sort of imagine this as sort of disappearing back into your cave a little bit and starting to really question everything around you. So this sort of dropping of illusion, this inquiry kicks in absolutely at this stage, but potentially in quite a challenging way of really starting to question all that I know. And I think individual stage could be almost quite lonely, because you start to pull away from what you've known as a norm most of your life, and you start to really fully question everything around you, I think, really. So things start to deconstruct. Now, a new way of knowing is coming through. So there's some buds of thinking differently, of processing things differently, of having a different sense of things. But the individualist is almost in that kind of turmoil of trying to make sense of it, and then potentially resorting back to the comfort of just being really busy and doing everything I know I need to do. Um, and I think, there's something about becoming more present within the individualist stage, and indeed the post-conventional stages. So having the ability to hold a presence and to suddenly get that moment in the meeting room or in the very busy train that they're on, and to be able to suddenly become very aware of the moment and actually holding on to that, because that's all they know at that point in time. So individualist in the cave, having a bit of a, midlife crisis sort of thing. And then I think strategist is again a huge shift. These, as I said, these are years. And strategist is almost kind of optimizing this new way of knowing and seeing. So what the individualist new way of thinking and inquiry, the strategist is able to sort of harness that and go, okay, well, this is interesting actually, because I can take that understanding or different perception and I can start to use it in a different way. And one of the things about all of these stages within vertical development is this stepping back of perception. So imagine being, in the opportunist, being on the dance floor, in amongst it, like, yeah, what am I going to get out of this? And you're gently stepping back. So by the time you're sort of strategist, you are on the balcony and it's this wonderful view of everything. So systems thinking coming through of seeing the interconnectedness of things and being able to integrate. So it's an incredibly creative stage, I think, in that you can start to bring things together which perhaps before wouldn't have worked, or you couldn't hold two things at the same time. So it's about co-creation and paradox, essentially, of holding different things at the same time. So um, and then there are stages beyond, and those of you who know vertical development knows it goes to alchemist and ironist, and there's lots of other descriptors, because of course this is based on the LDP. There are other vertical development profiling tools out there, and they've all got slightly different language, but essentially it's all the same stages. So I'm going to stop sharing at this moment so I can see your faces. And I would just love to pause and kind of check in on how it's landing for you, and kind of what sense you're making of this.
Yeah. And I think we're a small enough group, George, that we can just invite people to speak. So,
Please do, yeah.
yeah.
So I also trained with Heart Hill, and I was seriously considering using the LDP for an executive development program, which we're in the process of creating. And I also talked to Bill Torbert's organization, Global Leadership Associates, I think they're called.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there was a group of us involved in pulling this program, I should call it a learning journey, not a program, together. And we came to the conclusion that we felt really uncomfortable about the implicit hierarchy of the different action logics, and this sense that, if you're at a higher, more advanced level, you're better than other people. And we decided that it would be divisive and unhelpful. And so we did not actually go that route. We haven't completely relegated it to history, but we kind of like, and there were also contextual things going on, our particular, where we are in terms of our evolution as an organization, the maturity of our leadership, and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
But it does seem to me that if you look at vertical leadership purely through the lens of action logics, it's problematic.
Yeah.
That's all I would say.
Great.
Yeah.
It'd be good to hear from others, I think. Before we respond, it would be great to hear from some others.
Yeah, great.
Oh, it looked like Ed was going to speak there.
Yeah, sorry, I'm struggling with my mute button. So I've thought about the action logics in the frame of it was a sort of an Apex development program bringing innovators together from different organizations across Wales, and the faculty on this development program were, Edmund Hillary's son, and like people, or Harry Hahn, who's like kind of essentially disruptors in their field, and so wanting to there was quite an interesting application process for getting onto this program.
Yeah.
But recognizing that, that switch that you talked about between achiever and individualist, and trying to identify the people who have moved beyond achiever, because they are most likely to benefit from the program, that they are prepared to challenge convention, they are prepared to join different perspectives together and create more than the sum of the parts, and all this sort of stuff. So it was, I absolutely get what Tim was saying in terms of the challenge of kind of higher up is better, And actually, funnily enough, that seems to tap into the achiever mindset of, yes, I want to get to the top. But you know, how do you use it in a way maybe a bit behind the scenes, but to flush out who is it that we're inviting into a sort of a set of discussions or an intervention of some type?
Yeah.
Lovely. Thank you, Ed. Others?
Yeah, I'm happy to leap in. So look, I mean, this is in no way the core field in which I normally operate, but I find it fascinating. I mean, I do a lot of work with organizational culture in general, and the transition from sort of short-term profit max organizations to purpose-led, values-driven, sustainable. And I suppose inherent within that, there's a shift from sort of me to we, ego to eco, systems thinking within the overall mindset and worldview of the organization. So I sort of am slightly accessing this kind of like thinking on the one hand about what does this mean for leadership, maybe capabilities, but on the other hand, what does it mean for the worldview and the mindset of an organization in its totality in terms of how people relate to the job of being in business and what are we all here to do and all that sort of stuff. I have a little question around how it might link to Ken Wilber and spiral dynamics. I don't know if you've come across that, George, probably I'm sure you have, and how that then links through to teal organizations, Frederic Laloux, that whole area, which I suppose sort of informs my work a little bit more. I'll leave it there.
Right. I know that George could wave a pile of books next to her, which would help to make those connections between Talbot section logics and spiral dynamics and various other things, which I may ask her to do in a moment. But anybody else want to respond to how is this landing?
So for me, yes, for me, it's really interesting. I come from the Ashridge relational coaching perspective. And just on a personal basis, I could fall into all of those. And particularly I thought, oh, I think I'm at the individualist stage now, you know. Can I remove myself and can I just go into a cave and think about it and have my own opinions, being strong about it? It's really interesting. It's almost like it's just opening up my mind, Georgina, into how we can, and of course you're talking about years of development. So yeah, I'm finding it very interesting. And I'm also just very aware of not falling into a boxed scenario on any of those phases. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah, I would sort of second that I found it really interesting, not actually something that I'd come across in the way that you've described it before. So yeah, lots to think about.
Lovely. Right, last few seconds for anybody else to chip in, and then we'll go back and invite George to respond to some of this. Alex, is that you going to say something?
Yeah, no, it's quite fascinating. I'm kind of interested in how you actually assess where someone is, whether it's a self-evaluation or an external assessment of someone's position in life. And I am mildly aware of the sentence completion test because I think I did it once about 5 years ago, which was kind of fun. And I thought, wow, how does this thing work? So I'm just intrigued about, whether you can self-evaluate or someone else has to do that for you. And just curious. That's all I want to say.
Right. George.
Yes. Yeah. Well, let me start with you, Alex, because I did wonder if someone was going to ask that. So Harthill uses sentence completion assessment, and I must say, when I came across this 18 years ago now, I was really blown away by it. You know, I've metric tools in my time. Sentence completion is something very different. So it's a start of a sentence, my mother is, when I was a child, and then it's over to you. So you complete that sentence. I think it's about 34 questions. And at the time, learning about within the accreditation that there was then a group of people who would sit and assess this. They would be going through every single questionnaire and assessing based on someone's response which action logic was showing up. And again, this was mind blowing for me. I imagine this sort of people living in some sort of hobbit village, like, really sort of mystical beings who were able to decipher this stuff. It was incredible. Now, whether it's moved on with Heart Hill, and it'd be interesting, Richard, I know you qualified a lot later than me, whether that assessment, whether they've automated it now, clearly with the wonders of technology, or it's still these wonderful individuals assessing the sentence completion response.
It is still a few individuals that assess it, and if they think it's borderline between two action logics, they will take it onto like an assessor and refer it to someone else just to double check their workings. So
Yeah.
I'm not qualified to do it, but I can see why a sentence would fall into one action logic or another based upon it.
Yeah.
And I think behind the methodology, there's a whole field of academic work, which is Suzanne Crook-Greuter, is it right? Who,
right, yeah.
a professor of ego development theory, and it's the questions come from, or the sentence completion methodology has its roots in the academic work of ego development theory, I believe.
Well, it was actually, and it was actually Jane Lovinger as well, who was with the ego development theory, and then I think it was from that work she started with a sentence completion, and they've turned it into an organizational setting assessment tool. But yeah, it's fascinating, and Will, absolutely. I mean, it's all clearly, it always is interlinked, isn't it? So adaptive systems, adaptive organizations, spiral dynamics, it's a huge field, and you can see how it all maps across actually in terms of the organizational conscience and how that evolves alongside the people within it. And actually, there's studies on the CEO's action logic or meaning making stage, and therefore the organization and where that is in terms of sense of community purpose, doing something for the greater good. So it's absolutely interlinked in that place. And Ed and Tim, wonderful you said that, because actually that, it's the next part of my story that I wanted to share, because it absolutely, the profiling, so, the debriefing of a tool, I think is incredibly problematic because of the very nature of it being hierarchical, actually. And I think debriefing LDP is one of the most, it can be one of the most challenging debrief conversations versus a personality profiling tool or something, because it can really get into some complex conversation about where someone is at. And then if they're in an action logic, the later ones will seem like a complete enigma, and then there's a frustration because, well, what does that mean? And you can tie yourself in knots, really. But let me carry on the story that I was telling you, and it is about, so how have I used this? Because of course when I came across it in my late 20s, I was like, wow, this is really profound. It helped me so much personally. I think this is why I'm so passionate about it, from what it brought me in terms of my understanding of self, but then to be able to overlay this as an understanding of an organization that I was working in. And I was working in a small unitary council at the time. So public sector, hugely complex in itself, politics, big P, little p, and at that time, the senior leaders were facing an enormous challenge. So they had like a 30 million deficit, in funding. They had a whole organization transformation ahead of them. They were having to reshape services. So, talk about burning platform, this was really, really big challenge for those leaders. So what we did was build this strategic leadership program. And of course, this is where I got to meet Chris all those years ago. And one of the models that was presented, which kind of was the founding piece, I guess, to say, right, here's the challenge, and it all got set out. This is what you're up against, and sort of, all those quite difficult meetings of people feeling really quite concerned about the future. And then it was, so how can we start to enable you to think about things differently? So one of the models, which I guess described the reality at that moment for those leaders, was one. And I'm going to share this slide. And I'm sure, Chris, you're going to recognize this because, of course, you were at Ashridge at this time, weren't you?
Not only will I recognise it, but I think Tim will probably recognise it, and Alex and Will have probably seen a version of it. Teresa might well have seen it from Ashridge days. Yeah, this is based on Stacey, isn't it?
Yeah.
Mm.
And, I think this was immediately helping that group of leaders to, see that there's what they're up against, clearly, but also how we can start to work through this. So introducing vertical development as leadership as meaning making worked, I think, in this context. So to explain this, have the burning platform of the challenge, and then explain, leadership as meaning making, I think started to help them think about how they could develop a different way of thinking. And, it's all about developing mental complexity, isn't it? To help leaders navigate through the chaos, essentially. So, oh, just had a bit of feedback. Is that a question or was it just feedback?
Well, do you know, I was just looking at that because I've never written about it, but the time we spent, and I think I have to just name it because I have named it. The Unitary Council was Swindon. It was really formative for me actually because it was my first time of working with Action Logic. So there was a guy, was it Sol
Davidson,
who did my profile for me. That was my introduction to it, and then I was really struck by the connection between that and the use that was made of Action Logics, but without naming Action Logics, in the Ashridge Masters in Change and Consulting. So Torbert's work was important in it, but we never featured the stagers. So when I was a master's student, I didn't I never did the instrument, for example. So Sol was the first person who had me do the instrument. And I was struck by just how important it was in that case that the CEO of the council had a systemic enough view of the world to entertain this way of working.
Yeah.
And I have no idea what the CEO's profile was. I just know he held a space.
Yeah.
It was possible for people to experiment and explore.
Yeah.
And I think there's something in there that I learned a huge amount from, but also I wonder if it could even have worked, if we'd even have started, but for that hierarchical intervention of a senior enough person, open enough to try something different.
Yeah. And it really, it forged the way. They were doing some really innovative, really groundbreaking, experimental work around particularly social care and really turning it on its head in terms of, how they're working with families and so on. So there were some fantastic things going on. I think it was a really pivotal moment actually for the council and for many people within it to suddenly have this understanding of vertical development.
Yeah, and my role mainly was to work with the politicians in the end. I ended up working with it was a Conservative controlled council, and I worked with the cabinet, and Ron Blue was the leader of the council. And I didn't realise this so much at the time, but I've read a book since by Hilary Cottam about the work that was done there with families, Radical Help, and the framing of that, and how much it depended on Rod providing cover to hold the space for this experiment when people were going, no, be tougher on the families. And we're going, let the families work this out for themselves. We're going to really support the hell out of them. And it was such radical work. And you would never imagine a Conservative cabinet doing that work. And they did. Yeah. And if you've not read the book, it's fantastic work. Fantastic work. I'll put a link to Hilary Cottam's book in the chat.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. So yeah, and I mean, but to your point, Tim, and it was interesting when you raised that around, it being problematic, because I immediately did then see the sort of dark side coming out from using it as a profiling tool. Because what of course happened is there was a group within that senior leader population. So it was I think it was about 20 that had gone through this sort of strategic leadership program. But there was a smaller population who of course profiled at post-conventional. And then of course what happened was they all then got together, and some wonderful rituals came out. So they started to do, some weekly mindfulness sessions together every Wednesday morning and get to. But I could really observe this sort of, problematic side of it. It became quite elitism, and because we're post-conventional, and then other people weren't, and so I sort of started to see quite early on this dark side of you using a hierarchical tool like this. And the other experience I had, I mentioned this earlier, was doing the debrief to individuals who were just at the cusp between a achiever and individualist, or moving into individualist. A couple of these individuals were in a really tough moment in their life because they were fundamentally questioning everything around them, that their relationships, their job, and so there was a sense of ethics that came through for me as well, of using these types of tools within an organizational setting, because this isn't personal development. I'm signing up to therapy. This is, I'm turning up to work and wanting to be a better leader. And actually some of these tools can really open up Pandora's box, I think, for some individuals. So I became aware of ethics at that time. And yeah, how much does an organization expect people to develop within them, because it can open up. It's holistic, right? People, it affects the whole person. This is not just about learning to give good feedback and have challenging conversations. So yeah, really pivotal moment in my learning and starting to work with vertical development. And then from there I went back into corporate world, and suddenly became very aware again, having gone from public sector, which again I think people didn't think would be innovative or agile or doing some groundbreaking experimental work, and went back into sort of corporates, and they were very conventional actually. And so what I was learning then was knowing what lands and what doesn't. So with those, with any OD tool, so vertical development or others that I work with, getting a sense of this isn't going to land actually with making sense either to the HR director or the CEO and so on. And so concepts around adaptive learning, leadership as meaning making, having those conversations within the HR leadership team, or even with the senior exec team, getting a sense of this is not where they are right now. And I think it links back, Will, to your comment about sort of organizational maturity and kind of where they are in their thinking and evolution, and therefore what's the right OD intervention that's going to enable them rather than just confuse them, essentially. But I did do some LDP profiling with just a couple of more progressive HR leaders, and of course I'm still in contact with them today because it had that profound impact on them at that point. And then, I've gone on to work with them years and years later. So I think when it lands, it really lands, it really sinks in and can be hugely beneficial to an individual. But it's knowing when that moment is, essentially. So, and then I guess, years later, to your point, Ed, you sort of talk about it being behind the scenes. So I think starting to think about vertical development as more of a cultural diagnostic. So thinking about using it, the theory and the knowledge of it, but using it more to assess an organization in where it is. So it's more of a behind the scenes type of tool. And as soon as, a CEO is talking new long-term strategy, transformation, the HR leader is talking, we need a shift in the leadership culture. That's when I think, vertical development as a framework could really help here. And it's an enabler of transformation, because it's all about bringing greater capacity to leaders to be able to navigate the uncertainty and the complexity of the new strategy, the new change, the new world they're moving into. It's equipping them to do that and essentially have better decision making, better ways of processing things. So it's this kind of upgrade of the operating system, I think, that helps leaders within change and within transformation. So so I think, where it's more helpful is starting to translate it into language such as strategist ways of working. So some of the work that I've done more recently, and again, alongside Chris, so food manufacturer, we were working with vertical development, but actually turning it into language around strategist ways of working. So moving away from the very, you're this profile, you're that profile, but starting to talk about how do we as a leadership team collectively demonstrate these behaviors and ways of working and thinking and understanding. Because one of the things with vertical development, when I've used it in organizations, it's not about everyone becoming a strategist. That's not what this is. But clearly there are benefits of thinking in a strategist way, because that's the stuff that helps you navigate the complexity, make sense of things, have a broader perception, back on the balcony, systems view of everything going on. So so the work we were doing then was to try and translate from the boardroom how vertical development works into the logistics center or onto the factory floor and so on. So we were starting to develop some tools which were talking about navigate, explore. So kind of based on Stacey's work, actually, and this was taken from a really lovely session that GameShift ran with the leadership population, and there was an illustrator there for the day. So it was Beatrice, wasn't it? So she was there capturing all of the conversation. We've got these lovely illustrations from the whole day's event where we could, as I say, capture the conversations and turn it into something. And this particular picture was so useful, because I was able to then use this and take this into the logistics teams, take it into the sites and work with the leadership teams within sites to help them think about what is their vision and what is their local plan to deliver the strategy. And, again, where you're working with, I'd say predominantly a lot of experts and achievers, clearly, senior management, getting things done, particularly in a manufacturing environment as well, which is all machines, right? So it's all black and white and things work in a very procedural way. So this enabled this, it's okay not to know the answer, and actually have that language within those senior leadership teams on the site. And to say, actually, when you don't know the answer, you need to have a new way of being and doing things and thinking about things.
Yeah.
Will, I see a hand raised.
Can I, just before Will comes in, just say, in all the situations we've used this, you can do exploring from any action logic. I mean, it's not like you have to be a post-conventional action logic to do exploring. You can explore as an expert, you can explore as an achiever, you can explore as a strategist. I mean, it doesn't matter. But the point is, it will be different. And it's almost like any other difference. The awareness of the difference enriches the ability to use the exploring approach. Sorry, Will.
Yeah, thank you. I must admit, the last slide that you shared, George, that had these two axes of agreement and certainty, I don't think I had seen that before. And this is a much sort of simpler one, but I'm still actually just interested in hearing from you about those two axes and what the kind of the real meaning behind them is. Sort of the certainty axis I'm sort of getting, the agreement one I'm less guessing. Thanks.
Yeah, well, I think it's about knowing the answer, really. So if you think about how well do we know, is it something that is clearly defined? We just need to find the answer out. So within a sort of a scientific realm, you know, you go through a process or procedure, but you're fundamentally able to find out the answer and the truth. So there is an agreement. I'll just put it back up. And actually, when you move into, so this was the context within obviously public sector, when you move into social care, for example, that it becomes a lot more tangled and nebulous around what is the right way, what is the answer. So the truth is, there's multiple versions of the truth. So there's agreement starts to fall out, really, because people aren't agreeing on what is needed. Does that make sense, Will?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I would also say, I mean, this comes from the work of Stacey, but it comes from the work of Stacey in about 2003 or 4. In Ralph's later work, they moved away from ever using this model. And I remember round about 2010, I was doing some work with Patricia Shaw at Schumacher College. And I actually laid this out on the floor for a conversation around sustainability work in organizations. And Patricia was, you know, oh my God, you know, you've drawn this model. We gave this model up in 2003. I said, well, yeah, but I'm not sure you should have done, you know, because if you ask people to stand on this and inhabit the space and talk about it, it's enormously rich, because people have an embodied sense of the great cosmic sucking force in organizations that tends to pull towards certainty, even when we don't have any certainty. But if I was going to plot this today, I wouldn't plot it on a single piece of paper. It's almost, for me, it's like a sphere.
Yeah.
And the death through equilibrium and the death through disintegration kind of meet at the pole. Yeah. You know, so I'm working with universities at the moment who I can feel this struggle of, if we don't change fundamentally, the university model is so broken, in not just in the UK, you know, we are going to fall to bits because we can't change. But if we change too much, we could all become completely virtual, you know, replicas of Coursera or something, and be nothing. You know, so you've got this tension, and I see it almost, these death through disintegration, death through equilibrium, as complexity going around a sphere. The thing I do like around this particularly, though, is the sense of the pull, where all the arrows go. And I do feel those in every organization conversation I go into, and not just organizations. You actually feel it in your body, the pull for control, and particularly in the top left there, you've got the power and politics pull. There's such a pull to, you know, nobody agrees stuff. Right, I'm just going to assert some power to get agreement. Zoof, pull. And you can get CEOs or council leaders or vice chancellors of universities or bigwig professors doing that pull to certainty by charismatic power. And it collapses all the creative possibility in an instant. You know, and for me, I almost don't care about the action logics model, as in the LD framework, you know, what's called the assessment tool, but I care enormously about the reality of these different tensions and pulls and the ability to hold a space where multiple ways of seeing can coexist together. Because otherwise, everything falls to some form of equilibrium or disintegration.
Yeah.
And I think this is where both Stacey and Talbot have done work of such enormous importance the time we're in, of helping us to visualize and hold a space where better ways of seeing and doing become possible.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris. Thank you. So, so I think, you know, just in conclusion, really, with all of this is, and with any OD model, it's about the translation for me. It's about how you take these theoretical ways of understanding and turn that into tools and language that is accessible for individuals in the business. So it isn't elitism, you know, it isn't over intellectualized. It's something that organizations and teams can really get hold of and use in a meaningful way. And it doesn't matter, you know, as we've said, what action logic they are, but they are learning new ways of understanding and working, you know, with complexity or navigating new strategy or whatever it is. So so keeping it simple, I think is, you know, really important. My last slide is this whole, how do you take something so very complex, and we've covered so many theories today, and it's, you know, mind-blowing really, that the integration now of all that we know in this field, and it's ever expanding in terms of our awareness of consciousness and so on, and but then actually turning it into something really simple and practical for people to get hold of and use, that's going to help them and enable them. You know, this is all about helping people, particularly through change and transformation, where it's a whole heap of uncertainty and complexity, and how people navigate that on a personal level and within teams as well. So yeah, I'm going to stop my slides now and open it up, really, because it would be lovely to hear from many of you in terms of your further reflections or any further examples of where vertical development has worked really well, or, you know, where it's potentially had more of a challenging side to it, I guess, the dark side of profiling with a hierarchical tool.
Yeah, I just want to say, if they haven't gone already, to Rachel and Will, thank you very much for joining us. It may be that they've gone now, but I noticed they both have to get to 9:30 things, which often happens on these calls, sadly. I mean, one of the things that struck me, George, was back in my dim and distant past, I was involved in psychotherapy training at the Institute of Psychosynthesis, which is where I had my exposure to clinical therapy work. And they're based on the thinking of Roberto Assagioli, who was a Jungian, one of Jung's students. And at the heart of psychosynthesis is a sense that we're not inherently integrated selves. We don't have a single personality. You know, in fact, we're a loose alliance of sub-personalities that attach to different contexts and different historical periods. So I will have a whole bunch of sub-personalities that relate to my profession, my roles, my experiences. And as over the years I've put action logics together with that, you know, I see all these action logics alive and well in me right now. It's not like I've matured out of them. I have a perfectly functional opportunist, thank you very much, that can stomp my foot and behave like a 2-year-old when I don't get what I want. Yeah. But I think we've all got the potential for, the most glorious alchemist or ironist as well. It's just a question of whether life ever gives us the opportunity to inhabit that space. Yeah. I don't think it's like, it might be some really shocking stuff that opens the door to something, that opens a life experience to go, oh, I've gone through something really bad, and it opens up a different space. But I think we can get away from the hierarchical side of this by seeing it more like colors on a palette, like an artist's palette. And these are different aspects of ourselves, different ways of being that we probably all have access to a lot of them.
Yeah.
And we just get more access to some of them by life experiences that we have or don't have. But I certainly have 6 or 7 of them operative. I haven't grown out of the early ones or anything like that.
No, absolutely. There was a great example of that, actually. A lady was talking on a podcast about, when she gets on the plane, that opportunist kicks in. She wants to get her luggage up into that space when she's got her cabin bag. So, we do resort back into those places of those things kicking in, I think, for sure. And interestingly, my own experience of it, I actually regressed in my own profiling. So, Richard, you'll remember from doing my debrief, I went backwards, and so it just goes to show we are the product of our environment, and the job I was doing at the time had a huge role that I was trying to get delivered. So it wasn't surprising actually where my action logic had fallen into. So it's just with this constant flow, aren't we, of all of these dynamics within us.
I'm just kind of thinking about if you drop this into a collective, that like you were saying, it kind of potentially pulls out some of the schisms and the kind of othering and, well, I'm functioning at this stage and whatever. And kind of your reflections on the different action logics are alive and well. So if you had a board senior leadership team, there will be an aspect of their team life where they have to get shit done. Essentially, they have to operate as an achiever, and then you hear accounts of chief execs who say, actually my job is to make maybe 1 or 2 decisions a year, where they are like, I am going to inhabit the space of the strategist or alchemist, and I'm going to trust my team to make the magic happen elsewhere, to kind of keep the handle turning. But I'm wondering whether if it's presented as there is an ideal pull that people operate at a more kind of a higher level. If there is that pull, then you might get that schism, and I can hear that at an individual level, it's really powerful and it drops into where you are and kind of challenges your assumptions. And I'm wondering how it then, when you overlay group dynamics on top of that, it just gets really messy.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can see that actually within a group, you see the different action logics coming through and where the tension therefore is in the conversation, where they're not making sense of one another almost. And I always imagine action logics as everyone's just wearing different colored sunglasses. So everyone's just everyone's got a blue pair of sunglasses or red or something. And therefore, that's when there can be frustration and tension in the room, because they are coming at it from a different perspective. But I think this is where, where I have seen it work, as I say, is if you translate strategist into a nice set of ways of working as a team, principles we're going to sign up to. And it's about, being present, being honest, calling things out, being generous in our support of others, whatever it is, you can translate that into some nice, accessible principles for a team to be working with. I think that's when it does work and is effective. within those sort of team dynamics.
Can I add a comment here? First of all, George, it's a great topic, and thank you for talking about this today. It's really good. And what I really like about what you're saying is you move from the kind of the deeper theory to the simple and practical, which is kind of the way I like to work as well. And I wanted to say, I think we were saying before, Chris, you were saying you can be multiple levels. What you said, whether life gives us the opportunity to inhabit that space drives where we end up. But what I'm interested in as a practitioner as well is what kind of interventions can we design and deliver to enable people to move around those levels. So it's all very well saying you are at this level, and these are some ideas about how you can see the world differently. But what practical interventions can we design and deliver to push people around those different levels? Do you know what I mean? So, for example, I'm well known for doing my kind of experiential stuff with jazz, and improvisation, and I think that actively takes people, gives them different meaning-making senses to experience different parts of this rainbow or hierarchy. So, what other kind of interventions do we use, or could we come together to co-create to give people the experience of what it means, what it feels like to be an alchemist or an ionist or a strategist or whatever? So I don't, and I guess we've all got different ways of doing that, haven't we? Those interventions.
I mean, I've got my own view, but George, where would you start with that?
I think it's a great question. I think that's the nub of it, isn't it? How do we turn this into practical interventions? And I mean, an example I've got where it wasn't a practical intervention was a design of a tool which was done by the CEO, which was really post-conventional. So it completely turned performance management on its head. And I saw how much people struggled with it. So you're right in terms of how do we create those bridges between the different action logics to bring it to life for people, and make it accessible. I'm going to think about that one a bit more. Chris, what were you going to come in with?
Well, Gina, well, first of all, I'm going to say one of the people I know in the world who does this is Alex. So for those of you who don't know Alex's work, I mean, Alex is many things, but he includes in his work academic and sustainability consultant, and jazz musician, and OD facilitator. And when you put those together, you've got a kind of classic post-conventional mix, which is why I was so happy when Alex became part of GameShift, because our work is largely about the bringing together of enough difference so that no matter what your underlying action logic, there's a possibility of seeing more of the system in a richer way, so that some new conversation, some new insight becomes possible. And I suppose if I was to say, well, any intervention there are two kinds of interventions. One kind of intervention helps people to inhabit whichever action logic they're in as well as possible. There is, if your predominant action logic is expert, be brilliant at it. So there's a whole area of stuff to be brilliant at in your own action logic. And then there's also and how do you become aware of other action logics and how to work with them and in time move into them. And that kind of happens naturally, but it's just, if I think about Johari window, it's the new experience, new insight stuff of opening the adjacent space. And any experience that goes, oh, I've never drawn a picture of my organization before. How interesting. Oh, I've never heard my organization played as a piece of music before. How fascinating is that? And when Alex gets people to look at beginner's mind, I've never thought about my organization from beginner's mind before. Amazing. And that kind of thing. It doesn't push anybody into anything. It invites curiosity, and the curiosity will do the work. That's all we need. Hold the space, invite the curiosity. People will move or not move according to whether it's right for them. the organisation thing, I think I agree with George. You can use the broad shape of action logics as an intervention to say, well, actually, at this stage in our strategic growth, being more strategist about the way we organise stuff would be very useful. Maybe none of us are strategists, but we got some ways of working that we can develop ourselves to work with so that we can be more collaborative and creative in these spaces when we need to be. Cool. People can do that. We're not prisoners of one box.
Yeah. And it's definitely those ways of working, because, you know, I remember introducing, I was working with a logistics team, a large group of logistics guys, really wonderful to work with, but they get stuff done, right? It's logistics. So they're very like, tell me what the answer is, and we're just going to go away and do it. And bringing in something like we were with the workshop, we were just bringing in a check-in. So in the beginning of every session, we would spend time just talking about where were we right in that very moment. And honestly, the first couple of sessions were so awkward. They were so awkward because they were really uncomfortable with having to suddenly sit there and think about how they were. And it was really awkward, and having to hold that space and, you know, kind of work through it. But by about 3 or 4 workshops in, the quality of what people started to talk about in that check-in was incredible. You know, it really shifted away from, oh, well, I've got 3 meetings before and I've got to go and see Bob next week and I've got this on and I've got, you know, this company ringing me up and I need to say, you know, and suddenly it moved into I've had a really difficult morning this morning, and you know, my wife and I had a argument, or I had this sensation when I was coming into work that it's going to be, you know, whatever it was, but it really shifted. And I think they're so simple, those types of interventions as well, but it has such a big impact on people. But you have to sit with the uncomfortableness of introducing them, I'd say, with a new team as well. So yeah, even those little interventions, I think, have a big impact.
Wonderful. Yeah. Now we're heading towards the last chunk of this, so I want to make sure we give anybody a chance to raise questions who wants to. Probably in the next 5 or so minutes, we're going to have to start winding up. So, any other observations or questions for George?
I like the I like the way of that we've kind of talked through this morning in terms of almost taking the verticalness out of vertical development and looking at it as a series of lenses one might look through in terms of how do we function as a group, what's going on in our organization, that sort of thing. So it takes it from the individual to the collective, and it takes from the vertical out. But I'm also a bit wary of, does that completely undermine the principle of vertical development?
I'm not sure what would happen if Bill or Dennis Rook were here. I have or Elaine Herdman Barker or somebody. I have a feeling.
Yes, yeah.
I have a
Elaine,
feeling that I've stepped over some theological lines, but this is how I work with it. George, I mean, do you have a reaction?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think it's interesting that I think, you know, some people are very disciplined in their methodology, their framework, their, you know, where they're coming from in terms of what they use with organizations. And I'm much more of a, you know, mix it up a little bit, you know, and because it's about what lands. Fundamentally, it's got to be about what makes a difference and what actually enables individuals or teams or organizations. So I love to use a range of different models. You know, I've worked with organizational constellations, and you know, so I'm a bit more of a pick and mix type of person, and I'm, as I say, probably highly offensive to the founders of some of this work, but I think it's about evolving it into a place of practicality. I think really when you're working with, particularly when you're in HR teams, you've got to make it practical and it's got to land in a set of people processes that people start using, because otherwise it ends up being a very stimulating, very interesting conversation, and it doesn't really permeate through the organization if you can't bed it into some ways of working, some tools and so on. So
That's lovely.
yeah.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that from my practice. I'm sure that if I was to dig deep enough into the theory, which I'm not going to do, there would be some differences that people go, actually, this part is inherently must be hierarchical. But for me, in practice, I love the way you just described working with it pragmatically, George. Yeah. And can I just say thank you very much? I mean, it's been great to have you do this and to share your very practical experience of working with it in all kinds of places. So
Thanks, Chris. Well, it's great to be part of the GameShift team. So great to be here. Thank you.
yeah,
And
we
I think
will.
if anyone,
Go
yeah,
on.
sorry, I was going to say if anyone would like to carry on the conversation, it's been really whistle-stop tour of the theory today. As you can probably tell, it's vast and big and broad. So if anyone would like to carry on the conversation today, then do let us know, and we'd be really happy to do so. So yeah, and thank you for turning up this morning.
Well, what we'll do afterwards is we'll give a link to this recording to everybody who's registered as having an interest in this. I'll write a blog just of my experience of being part of this, which George, I'll ask you if you're willing to co-author with me so that we can get something out. And then we will remind people of the invitation that if there's anything that's you'd like to explore further, we're always happy to do another call. I just want to say something about the next pop-up we've got. Richard, I was trying to get a link to Brian's pop-up, and I've managed not to copy the link over. Could you pop it in the chat for me? Yeah. But the next pop-up, which is in May, but I don't know the date. Oh, it's in April rather, but I don't know the date. When is it, Richard? 18th of April, I believe.
18th of April, yeah.
So the 18th of April, we have Brian, and Brian Baglow is a brilliant guy. We came across him when we sponsored Scottish Games Week, and it's part of GameShift's activity in Scotland, the gaming network. So people who write games and promote video gaming as an industry. It's a booming industry in Scotland, and Brian's role has been to bring together organisations from the very tiny to the unicorn across that gaming sector and start to create an ecosystem so that people can learn from each other and can also have a bigger voice in the policy environment to get education and government aware that computer games is actually a really big industry and a massively creative one that provides outlets for everybody from cartoonists to musicians to logicians to all kinds of stuff. It's bigger than the film industry in some places. So Brian is going to come along on the 18th of April and talk about how did he go about inviting and bringing together this participation. I think it'll be a fascinating insight into creating an ecosystem across an industry. So that's where we go next. Meanwhile, we'll be in touch really soon. Thank you to George and thank you all for coming. And we'll hopefully see you again at some point. Have a good day. Have a good week.
Bye.
So much.
Thanks so
Bye
much.
now.